Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive.
Thanks for having me.
Today we're tackling a topic that's super important for anyone who works with cranes. We're talking fall protection.
Yeah.
So if you're a safety professional, a crane operator, or even if you're thinking about getting your crane operator license, this one's for you.
Absolutely.
We're really going to break down OSHA standard 1926.1423, which covers all the specific requirements for preventing falls on cranes. And trust me, understanding this standard is not just about checking boxes. It's about making sure everyone goes home safe at the end of the day.
That's right. It can be the difference between life and death out there.
Absolutely. And we're so excited to partner with Safety One Source for this episode.
Yeah, great folks over there.
They're all about providing the resources and knowledge you need to create a safer work environment.
For sure.
But before we get into the details, let's take a step back and talk about why this standard is so important.
Okay.
I mean, we all know falls are a major hazard in construction, but what makes cranes particularly risky?
Well, think about, right? You're often working at significant heights, sometimes hundreds of feet in the air.
Wow.
And you're dealing with heavy equipment, moving parts, and sometimes challenging weather conditions.
Right.
All of these factors combined create a high-risk environment where falls can have devastating consequences.
Right. So it's not just the height, it's the whole context of crane operations that makes fall protection so critical.
Yeah, for sure.
Now, one thing that often trips people up is figuring out which cranes this standard actually applies to.
Right.
Is it a one-size-fits-all situation, or are there some nuances we need to be aware of?
It's definitely not one-size-fits-all.
Okay.
While most sections of 1926.1423 apply to a wide range of cranes, there are some important distinctions. For example, some sections specifically exclude tower cranes.
So tower cranes have their own set of rules.
Yeah.
I'm guessing because of their unique design and the way they're assembled.
Exactly.
Okay.
Tower cranes have some unique requirements, particularly when it comes to access and egress, which we'll get into a bit later.
Got it.
But for now, let's focus on some of the more general requirements that apply to most types of cranes.
Okay. Sounds good.
Sounds good.
Now, I've heard a lot of people talk about the 6-foot rule in construction, meaning you need fall protection if you're working more than 6 feet above a lower level.
Right.
Does that same rule apply to trains, or is it different?
It's similar, but there are some important differences.
Okay.
For regular train operations, things like maintenance, inspections, repairs, that 6-foot rule does apply.
Okay.
So if you're on a walking or working surface that's more than 6 feet up and has an unprotected side or edge, you need fall protection.
That makes sense. But what about when you're actually putting the crane together or taking it apart?
Yeah.
I'd imagine that's a lot riskier than, say, doing some routine maintenance on a stable platform.
You're right. Those assembly and disassembly tasks are inherently more hazardous because the crane itself is in a less stable state.
Yeah.
And that's why the fall protection threshold is higher 15 feet instead of 6.
Wow. So a significant difference there.
Yeah.
I'm starting to see why it's so important to really understand the nuances of this standard.
It is, yeah.
And here's another important distinction. Even within those height thresholds, there are specific situations where fall protection is always required, regardless of how high up you are.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Okay, now you got me curious. Give me an example of one of those situations.
Sure. Imagine a worker walking on a non-lattice boom.
Okay.
That's the solid kind of boom.
Okay.
Whether they're 3 feet or 30 feet off the ground, they need fall protection if that boom is horizontal or angled.
So basically, anytime you're walking on one of those solid booms, you're strapped in, no exceptions.
Exactly. And the same goes for walking on a lattice boom with the open framework if it's not horizontal.
Okay.
So if you're climbing up or down that lattice structure, you need fall protection.
I see. So it's not just about the height, it's about the type of surface you're on and what you're doing.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Now, what about those lattice booms?
Yeah.
I was surprised to learn that guardrails aren't always required on the walkways.
Yeah.
That seems a little counterintuitive when you're talking about fall protection.
It does seem a bit odd at first glance.
Yeah.
But there's actually a practical reason for this exception.
Okay.
You see, on booms that are supported by pendant ropes or bars, those guardrails could actually create a snagging hazard.
Oh, okay.
And imagine trying to install and remove guardrails every time you assemble or disassemble the boom.
Right.
Not very practical, right?
Right, that makes sense. So in cases where guardrails are allowed on lattice booms, is there a height limit?
Yes, they can't be any taller than 45 inches.
Okay.
That height strikes a balance between providing some protection and minimizing the risk of interference.
Interesting. So we've got those lattice booms covered.
Right.
But how do workers get up to the operator workstation safely in the first place?
Yeah.
I mean, we're talking about some serious heights here.
You're hitting on a really important point.
Yeah.
Safe access and egress are critical, and this is where things get really specific.
Okay.
For any crane manufactured after November 8, 2011,
Okay.
there are strict regulations about how you access the operator workstations.
So newer cranes have to meet these specific criteria for getting up and down.
Exactly, and those criteria cover everything from the types of access devices you can use to the standards they need to adhere to.
Okay.
For most cranes, that means they have to meet either SAE J185, which is the standard from the Society of Automotive Engineers,
Okay.
or ISO 16060-2.1994, which is the international standard.
Okay, and those standards lay out specific requirements for things like steps, handholds, ladders, and guardrails.
Right. They ensured a consistent level of safety and reliability for all those access devices.
Okay.
And one more thing I'll mention here, which is super important.
Yeah.
All walking and step-in areas on the crane need to have slip-resistant surfaces.
Okay.
It's all about minimizing the risk of slips and falls, especially at those heights.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So we've talked about the height requirements for fall protection, the specific rules for lattice booms,
Right.
and the importance of safe access and egress.
Right.
But what about the fall protection systems themselves?
Yeah.
What are the different types we need to be aware of?
Right.
And how do they work?
Well, when it comes to cranes, there are three main types of fall protection systems that OSHA outlines in this standard:
Okay.
personal fall arrest systems, fall restraint systems, and positioning device systems.
Okay.
And it's crucial to understand the differences between them because each system has a unique purpose and works in a slightly different way.
Okay, let's start with personal fall arrest systems.
Okay.
I've heard those are the most common type used in construction overall, right?
That's right.
Okay.
A personal fall arrest system is essentially designed to stop a fall in progress.
Okay.
Think of it as your last line of defense.
So if a worker falls, the system is there to catch them.
Exactly. It typically consists of a full-body harness, a lanyard, and a connecting device that attaches to an anchorage point.
Okay.
When a worker falls, the system engages and arrests the fall, preventing them from hitting the ground.
That makes sense. So what about fall restraint systems?
Yeah.
How are those different?
A fall restraint system, as the name implies, is designed to prevent a fall from happening in the first place.
Right.
Instead of catching you after you fall, it restricts your movement so you can't even get to an edge or an area where you could fall.
Okay, so it's more about preventing you from getting into a dangerous position rather than stopping the fall itself.
Right.
That's interesting. And what about positioning device systems?
Yeah.
Those sound a bit more specialized.
They are. Positioning device systems are used to support a worker at a specific location and allow them to work with both hands free.
Okay.
So imagine you're doing some repairs or maintenance on a crane.
Right.
A position and device system could be used to suspend you safely in the right spot so you can focus on the task at hand.
I see. So it's not just about preventing falls. It's also about creating a safe and efficient working environment.
Right.
So we've got our three main types of fall protection systems: personal fall arrest, fall restraint, and positioning device systems.
Yep.
But are there any specific rules about when each system needs to be used, or is that left up to the worker's judgment?
OSHA definitely has specific rules about when fall protection is required on a crane, and we'll dive into those next.
Okay.
Because knowing when you need to be protected is just as important as knowing how the systems work.
Absolutely. Well, this has been a great start to our deep dive.
Yeah.
But it looks like we're just about out of time for part one.
Okay.
For our listeners who are already familiar with fall protection basics, are there any key takeaways from this section that you'd want to highlight?
If you're already in the safety world or working with cranes regularly, the big thing to remember is that cranes have their own set of fall protection rules that are distinct from general construction.
Okay.
So don't assume that what you know from other jobs automatically applies here.
Right. Those nuances can be really important.
Yeah.
And for those who are newer to this topic, what would you say is the most important thing for them to understand at this point?
I'd say the most important thing is that fall protection on cranes is not just about avoiding OSHA violations.
Right.
It's about understanding that this is a high-risk environment.
Right.
And that taking those extra steps to protect yourself and your coworkers can literally be the difference between life and death.
Well said. We'll be right back with part two, where we'll dig deeper into the specific situations where fall protection is required on a crane.
Sounds good.
Stay tuned.
All right. Welcome back, everyone. Before the break, we were talking about the different types of fall protection systems used on cranes.
Right.
Now let's shift gears and talk about when those systems are absolutely critical.
Okay, so knowing how fall protection works is one thing.
Right.
But knowing when you're required to use it is just as important.
Yeah.
And OSHA lays out some very specific scenarios in Standard 1926.1423.
They do.
We already touched on the height thresholds, that 6-foot rule for general crane work, and the 15-foot rule for assembly and disassembly.
Right.
But remember, even if you're below those heights, there are certain tasks where fall protection is non-negotiable.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, let's break those down. I remember you mentioned working on a non-lattice boom as one example.
Uh-huh.
Can you remind us why that's always a fall protection situation?
Sure, those solid booms, whether they're horizontal or angled,
Right.
don't have the same kind of built-in safeguards that you might find on other parts of the crane.
Okay.
So even a short fall could be dangerous.
Right.
OSHA wants to make sure anyone working on those booms has that extra layer of protection.
That makes sense. It's all about minimizing risk, even if the fall distance might seem relatively small.
For sure.
Now, what about those lattice booms? The ones with the open framework?
Right.
We talked about how they don't always have guardrails.
Yeah.
Does that mean fall protection isn't required on those booms?
Well, it depends.
Okay.
If the lattice boom is horizontal and the potential fall distance is less than 15 feet, fall protection might not be strictly required.
Okay.
But OSHA still emphasizes the importance of a competent person assessing the situation and determining if additional safety measures are needed.
Okay, so there's some room for judgment based on the specific circumstances.
Right.
But if that lattice boom is at an angle, meaning you're climbing up or down, then fall protection is a must, right?
Absolutely. Anytime you're climbing on those lattice structures, the risk of a fall is significantly higher.
Right.
So OSHA wants to make sure you're protected regardless of the height.
Right, because even if you're only a few feet up a fall from a lattice boom, could have serious consequences.
Exactly.
Now, what about when you're not actually walking or climbing on the boom?
Yeah.
But you're working at your workstation.
Right.
Say you're on a platform attached to the crane doing repairs or something like that.
If that workstation is on any part of the crane and you're more than 6 feet up, fall protection is required.
Okay.
That could be on the boom, the mast, the counterweights, anywhere that poses a fall hazard.
Wow. So it's pretty comprehensive, but I'm guessing there are some exceptions.
Sure.
Like if the workstation itself has railings all around.
You're right, there are a few exceptions.
Okay.
If the workstation has adequate guardrails or other fall protection measures in place,
Right.
then you might not need to use a personal fall arrest system or other equipment.
Right, because the idea is to have multiple layers of protection.
Exactly.
And speaking of exceptions, we talked earlier about how being in the cab, on the deck, or near the drawworks while it's running are also exceptions to the fall protection rules.
Right.
Why is that?
Those areas are generally considered to be safer because they have their own built-in safeguards.
Okay.
The cab, for example, is designed to protect the operator from falls, and the deck usually has railings or other barriers.
Okay, that makes sense. But even in those areas,
Yeah.
it's still important to be aware of potential hazards and take precautions to avoid falls risk.
Absolutely. Complacency can be dangerous even in areas that are generally considered safer.
Right.
Always be mindful of your surroundings and follow any safety procedures that are in place.
Great point. So we've covered the height requirements, the specific situations where fall protection is always required.
Right.
And some of the exceptions to the rules.
Right.
But what about the anchorage points? I mean,
Yeah.
you need a secure anchor point to attach your fall protection system to.
For sure.
What are the rules regarding anchorage points on cranes?
That's a great question, and this is where things get a bit unique for cranes.
Okay.
Unlike in general construction, where anchor points often need to be engineered and tested to withstand a certain amount of force,
Right.
the rules for cranes are a bit more flexible, shall we say.
Flexible. Okay, now I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
Well, OSHA uses this phrase, apparently substantial,
Okay.
when describing acceptable anchorage points on a crane.
Apparently substantial. That sounds like something out of a legal thriller.
Right.
But what does it actually mean in this context?
It means that a competent person has to use their judgment
Okay.
based on their experience and knowledge of cranes
Right.
to assess whether a particular point on the crane is strong enough to serve as an anchorage.
Okay.
It's not just about meeting a specific weight limit or passing a standardized test.
Right.
It's about a visual assessment combined with professional judgment.
So it's a bit more subjective than in other areas of construction safety.
Exactly, but that doesn't mean it's a casual glance.
Okay.
The competent person needs to carefully consider all the factors involved.
Right.
The type of crane, the load being lifted, the forces that will be exerted on the anchorage point if a fall occurs.
Yeah.
And any other potential hazards.
Right. So it's a big responsibility, and it highlights the crucial role that competent persons play in crane safety.
Yeah, big time.
But how do you even become a competent person in this area? I mean, it seems like you need a lot of specialized knowledge and experience.
You're absolutely right. Becoming a competent person for crane safety isn't something that happens overnight.
Right.
It requires extensive training, field experience, and a deep understanding of both crane operations and OSHA regulations.
So it's not just about being a skilled crane operator or a safety professional in general.
Right.
You need a very specific skill set to make those critical judgments about anchorage points and other fall protection measures.
Exactly. And that's why ongoing training and professional development are so important for anyone working in this field.
Right.
The safety landscape is constantly changing, and it's crucial for competent persons to stay up to date on the latest best practices and industry standards.
Okay, so we've got our competent person. They've assessed the situation, and they've determined that a particular point on the crane is apparently substantial enough to serve as an anchorage point.
Right.
But are there any limitations on what you can anchor to?
Yeah.
Like, can you just clip your lanyard to any random piece of metal on the crane?
Well, OSHA does provide some additional guidance in the standard.
Okay.
For personal fall arrest and position and device systems, the anchorage can be any apparently substantial part of the crane,
Okay.
unless the competent person determines through their visual inspection that a particular point wouldn't meet the criteria outlined in another section of the OSHA standard called 1926.502.
So there are some underlying strength and safety requirements that the anchorage point has to meet.
Right.
Even if those requirements aren't explicitly stated in terms of pounds of force or anything like that.
Right. And this is where things can get a bit technical.
Okay.
The section I mentioned, 1926.502, outlines specific criteria for anchorages used in fall protection systems.
Okay.
But it's important to remember that those criteria were written with general construction in mind, not specifically for cranes.
So how do we apply those general criteria to the unique environment of a crane?
That's where the competent person's judgment comes into play again.
Okay.
They need to be able to interpret those general requirements and apply them appropriately to the specific crane and the task at hand.
I'm starting to see why having a competent person on site is so crucial.
They are, yeah.
They're really the linchpin of the whole fall protection system.
Exactly. They're the ones who are ultimately responsible for ensuring that the fall protection measures are appropriate for the situation.
Right.
And that everyone on the job site is working safely at height.
Now, we've been talking a lot about anchoring directly to the crane itself.
Right.
But what about those portable anchor devices, the ones that can be attached to the crane?
Mm-hmm.
Are those allowed under OSHA?
Yes, absolutely. Those attachable anchor devices, as they're called, are perfectly acceptable under OSHA.
Okay.
But they have to meet some very specific requirements. For example, they have to be designed and tested to withstand a certain amount of force, just like anchorages in general construction.
So for those portable anchor points, you can't just rely on a visual inspection and a competent person's judgment.
Right.
You need to know that they've been engineered to meet certain strength standards.
Precisely, and those strength requirements are outlined in section 1926.502 of the OSHA standard, which we mentioned earlier.
Okay, so for those attachable anchor devices, we're back to those specific strength requirements.
Right.
But for anchoring directly to the crane itself, it's more about visual assessment and the competent person's judgment.
Right.
That's a key difference to keep in mind.
It is.
Now, what about anchor and fall restraint systems?
Yeah.
Those are the systems designed to prevent a fall from happening in the first place, right?
Yes, that's right. And for fall restraint systems, the anchor's point needs to be capable of withstanding twice the maximum load an employee might impose on it.
Okay.
During reasonably anticipated conditions of use.
So it's all about making sure that anchor point is strong enough to prevent any movement that could lead to a fall.
Right.
It makes sense. Now I have to ask about something I've always wondered about anchoring to the load line.
Uh-huh.
Is that ever allowed? I mean, it seems incredibly risky to me.
You're right. It does sound risky, and it is, which is why anchoring to the load line is only permitted under very specific and controlled conditions.
Okay, so there are situations where it's actually okay to anchor to the load line.
Yes, but it's not something to be taken lightly.
Right.
First and foremost, a qualified person, and I emphasize qualified, not just competent, has to determine that the entire crane setup, including the hook load line and rigging, is strong enough to handle the forces involved if a worker were to fall while anchored to the load line.
So it's not just about the strength of the load line itself, it's about the integrity of the entire system.
Exactly. And on top of that, the crane operator has to be present and fully informed that the load line is being used as an anchor point.
Right.
This is critical for communication and awareness.
Right. You wouldn't want the operator accidentally moving the load while someone is anchored to the line.
Right. Exactly.
What other conditions need to be met?
The most important condition, and this is absolutely non-negotiable, is that there cannot be any load suspended from the load line when a fall arrest system is anchored to it. Any weight on that line could compromise the anchor point and increase the risk of a catastrophic failure.
That makes perfect sense. You wouldn't want any added stress on the system if someone were to fall.
Right.
So anchor into the load line is allowed, but only under very strict conditions and with a lot of oversight.
Yeah.
It's definitely not something to be attempted without a thorough assessment and careful planning.
Absolutely. And this leads us to another crucial aspect of crane safety training.
Okay.
Because even with all the rules and regulations in place, human error is still a major factor in accidents.
Right. You can have the best fall protection equipment in the world, but if people don't know how to use it properly,
right,
or when it's required, it's not going to do much good.
Exactly.
So let's talk about those training requirements. What does OSHA say about training for workers who are exposed to fall hazards on cranes?
OSHA is very clear on this point. Anyone who could potentially be exposed to fall hazards while working on or around trains needs to be thoroughly trained.
Okay.
And that training needs to cover a lot of ground.
Like what specifically?
Well, first and foremost, they need to understand all the requirements of 1926.1423, which is the specific standard we've been focusing on today.
Right.
But they also need to understand the broader principles of fall protection,
okay,
which are outlined in other sections of the OSHA standards like 1926.500 and 1926.502.
So they need both the big picture and the crane-specific details.
Exactly. They need to know how to identify fall hazards, how to select and use the right type of fall protection equipment,
right,
how to inspect that equipment,
okay,
and how to rescue someone who's fallen.
Right.
And they need to understand the limitations of fall protection systems and the potential consequences of not using them properly.
It sounds like a lot to cover. Is there a specific OSHA-approved training program that employers have to use?
No.
Or can they develop their own?
OSHA doesn't mandate a specific training program.
Okay.
But they do provide a lot of guidance on what effective training should look like.
Okay.
And there are many reputable organizations that offer crane safety training courses that meet OSHA's requirements.
So employers have some flexibility, but they still need to make sure the training is comprehensive and covers all the necessary points.
Right. And it's not just about initial training either.
Okay.
Refresher training is also crucial for reinforcing safe practices and keeping everyone up to date on any changes or updates to the regulations.
That makes sense. The safety landscape is constantly evolving, so it's important to make sure workers are always armed with the latest knowledge and best practices.
Absolutely. And here's something else I want to emphasize.
Okay.
Training is not just about compliance.
Okay.
It's about creating a culture of safety on the job site.
Okay, I like that.
It's about empowering workers to identify and mitigate fall hazards, to speak up if they see something unsafe, and to take ownership of their own safety and the safety of their coworkers.
I love that. It's about going beyond just checking the boxes and really embracing a proactive approach to fall prevention.
For sure.
And that shift in mindset can make a huge difference in reducing accidents and saving lives.
Absolutely.
We've covered a lot of ground in this second part of our deep dive.
Yeah, we have.
We've talked about the specific situations where fall protection is required,
right,
the importance of competent persons, and their role in assessing anchorage points, the special considerations for anchoring to the load line, and the crucial role of training in preventing falls.
Right.
But it looks like we're just about out of time for this segment before we move on to part 3, where we'll wrap up our discussion and talk about some key takeaways.
Okay.
I want to take a moment to thank our sponsor for this episode.
Yes, this deep dive has been brought to you by Safety One Source, your go-to resource for all things safety-related.
Safety One Source offers a wide range of products and services to help you create a safer work environment.
They do.
Including training programs, consultant services, and all the latest safety equipment.
Absolutely.
Their commitment to safety aligns perfectly with what we've been talking about today.
For sure.
They understand that protecting workers from falls is not just about complying with OSHA regulations.
Right.
It's about creating a culture where safety is everyone's top priority.
Well said.
We'll be right back with part 3 of our deep dive into OSHA Standard 1926.1423, where we'll bring it all together and leave you with some final thoughts and actionable insights.
Okay, sounds good.
Stay tuned. And we're back for the final part of our deep dive into OSHA Standard 1926.1423.
Yeah, thanks for sticking with us.
We've covered a lot of ground, from the specific requirements for fall protection on crane to the crucial role of competent persons in training.
Absolutely.
It's been a really insightful discussion, and I feel like I have a much better grasp of how OSHA approaches fall protection in this unique and high-risk environment.
Yeah.
As we wrap up, I want to shift our focus a bit and talk about something that goes beyond just the letter of the law.
Okay, I like that.
What are we talking about?
We've talked extensively about OSHA compliance, meeting the minimum requirements.
Right, because those are the baseline. You have to know the rules of the game.
Exactly. But truly effective safety goes beyond just checking boxes.
I like where you're going with this. It's about creating a culture where safety is truly valued and embedded in everything you do.
That's it. It's about shifting from a reactive mindset, where you're just trying to avoid getting in trouble, to a proactive mindset where you're constantly looking for ways to improve safety and prevent accidents before they happen.
That's such an important distinction.
Yeah.
It's like the difference between wearing your seatbelt just because you don't want to get a ticket versus wearing it because you understand that it could save your life in an accident.
Exactly. And when it comes to crane safety, building that proactive culture starts with leadership.
So it's not just about the safety manager or the competent person on site.
Right.
It's about everyone from the CEO down to the newest worker, understanding that safety is a shared responsibility.
Absolutely. If safety is truly a core value of the company, that message needs to come from the top.
Right, because actions speak louder than words.
For sure.
If workers see that management is truly committed to safety, they're more likely to take it seriously themselves.
And it's not just about talking the talk.
Right.
It's about providing the resources, the training, and the support that workers need to work safely. It's about creating an environment where people feel comfortable speaking up if they see something unsafe without fear of retribution.
That's so important. You need that open communication and trust to build a truly effective safety culture.
Couldn't agree more. And when you have that culture in place, you start to see a real shift in how people approach safety.
Yeah.
It's no longer just about following the rules. It's about looking out for each other and making sure everyone goes home safe at the end of the day.
It becomes a personal commitment, not just a job requirement.
That's right.
Well said. So as we wrap up this deep dive into queen safety and fall protection, I think that's a powerful message to leave our listeners with.
It is. OSHA Standard 1926.1423 is a crucial tool for preventing falls and protecting workers.
But it's just the foundation. Building a truly safe work environment requires a deeper commitment, a culture where safety is everyone's top priority.
Absolutely.
And that's something we all have a role in creating.
For sure.
Huge thank you to our expert for guiding us through this complex and vital topic.
Thanks for having me.
And to you, our listeners, thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.
Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay safe.